Have you ever felt like there was something more beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary evening? A subtle shift in the air, an unexpected connection, and a moment that changes everything? That's exactly what happened one night when a simple dinner with my father took an unexpected turn. What began as a light-hearted evening with a movie soon evolved into a conversation that revealed hidden truths, unspoken emotions, and a bond that neither of us was prepared for. As our connection deepened, it became clear that what we were experiencing went beyond the father-child dynamic we had always known. And the question that lingered in the air was, where would this lead us? By the end of this video, you'll not only understand the complexity of relationships, vulnerability, and connection, but also gain insights into how these experiences shape who we are and how we relate to others. Don't miss the unexpected twists that unfold in this story, because this is more than just a tale of family. It's about how sometimes the most powerful moments come when you least expect them. Stick around till the end to uncover the truth about what happens when boundaries blur and relationships evolve in ways you never thought possible. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, I encourage you to click the subscribe button and ring the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest content. I'm eager to hear your thoughts on today's topic. If you enjoy the content, please comment 1 below. If it doesn't resonate with you, leave a 0. Your feedback is crucial as it helps me create better videos that align with your interests. Now, let's get started. The evening began simply enough, with a modest but comforting dinner shared between us. As the last bite lingered on our tongues, we decided to spend the rest of the night watching a movie. We picked a light-hearted comedy, hoping it would bring a sense of joy and relaxation, the kind of laughter that can ease away the weight of the world. But the moment the flickering light from the screen cast shadows on our faces, something in the air shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniably there. As our laughter filled the room, it didn't sound the way it usually did. It resonated with an unfamiliar depth, a richness that made each joke feel oddly significant, as though the punchlines held a secret message meant only for us. I couldn't help but notice his gaze more often than usual, his eyes lingering on me in a way that sent a quiet thrill through my body. It was as if he were trying to peer into my soul, to understand the unspoken thoughts that danced behind my eyes. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, convincing myself that it was nothing, just the intimacy of the moment. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to focus on the movie, my mind kept wandering, caught between an unspoken curiosity and a discomfort that I couldn't quite place. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the living room began to change, subtly but unmistakably. What started as casual conversation turned into something far more personal, revealing hidden corners of ourselves that had long remained untouched. My father, with a wistful look in his eyes, began sharing stories from his youth, stories he had never told me, not even my mother. These weren't just tales, they were windows into his past, a vivid portrait of a young man full of dreams, struggles, and unspoken desires. As I listened, I could feel the shift between us. The connection we shared, once defined by formality and distance, was evolving into something far more profound. I was no longer just his child, and he was no longer just my father. We were two souls, bound together by the threads of shared vulnerability. Each night, the conversations grew longer, more intense. What started as casual exchanges evolved into deep discussions, stretching from distant memories to reflections on life, love, and the intricacies of our hopes and fears. There was a rhythm to it, like a dance of words, a delicate ebb and flow that drew us closer with every passing hour. And then there were the silences. Oh, the silences! At first, they were just pauses, moments to catch our breath before diving back into another topic. But as time went on, the silences became something else entirely. They were thick and heavy, laden with unspoken thoughts and emotions, as if the air around us had become saturated with the weight of what we were both experiencing. One evening, as we sat together, the silence between us stretched longer than usual, suffocating the room with its intensity. My father looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. There was doubt, yes, an uncertainty that had never been there before, but also something else, something far more raw and unexpected. It was as if the barrier between us was slowly dissolving, exposing a side of him I had never seen. His gaze held a vulnerability, a longing, and even a trace of fear that mirrored my own. The father I had always known was no longer just a figure of authority. He was a man, just like me, navigating his own complex emotions. I couldn't bear the weight of that momentary silence any longer. Desperate to break the tension, I cracked a joke, hoping it would lift the heavy air and return us to something more comfortable. But instead of the light-hearted release I had hoped for, I felt him move slightly closer on the couch. It wasn't a move that felt wrong or inappropriate, but it was undeniably different. The space between us had shrunk, and with it, something more intimate had taken its place. A current of energy seemed to pulse through the room, and I could feel my heart begin to race in response. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for what might come next. My mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to stand up, to walk away and restore the distance that had always defined our relationship. But there was another part, a deeper, more insistent part, that told me to stay, to let this moment unfold, to see where it would take us. I was caught between the familiarity of my father's presence and the unfamiliar intensity of the bond that was slowly, but surely, taking root between us. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, and I couldn't help but wonder what the next chapter of our lives would look like, now that we were no longer just father and son, but two people standing at the edge of something far greater than either of us could have ever imagined. It was my dad, yes, but in that fleeting, surreal moment, he was so much more. He was a man who had lived a life of his own, a life filled with unseen struggles, quiet victories, and dreams he had carried in silence. As the hours melted away, we found ourselves submerged in a sea of words, each sentence drawn out from the depths of our souls. Our conversation ventured into unknown territories, places we had never dared to explore before. And with every word he spoke, a new layer of his essence revealed itself to me. He wasn't just the father I had always known. He was a man with a past, with hopes, fears, and experiences that had shaped him into the person he was before me. As we spoke, I began to see him in ways I never had before. The little details that had once slipped past me now seemed so profound. I noticed the way his eyes would brighten with a spark of life when he spoke about something dear to him, as though his entire being was infused with a memory of those moments. His voice would soften, and a slight, almost imperceptible smile would tug at the corners of his lips when he recounted stories that held special meaning. Stories that had, until then, been locked away in the vaults of his heart. These were not just anecdotes anymore. They were pieces of him, fragments of his soul laid bare for me to witness. If you are still watching this video, and find these lessons useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same way I did. When our eyes met, did his heart race with the same urgency I felt within my chest? Was he aware, just as I was, that something was shifting between us, something powerful and undeniable? The tension that hung in the air wasn't uncomfortable, as I would have expected. Rather, it was something far more complex. It felt like a promise, an invitation to explore something deeper than the father-son relationship we had always known. It was a silent acknowledgement that we were crossing into uncharted territory, and yet, there was no fear. Instead, there was a gentle sense of anticipation, as if we both recognized the delicate balance between the unknown and the beauty it held. In that suspended moment, when I thought the conversation might come to an end and the air would return to its familiar rhythm, he did something that took me completely by surprise, something that left me breathless. He leaned toward me, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. My heart thudded violently in my chest, and my mind, once full of questions, went eerily blank. It was as if every thought, every reason, every excuse vanished in the face of the raw intensity of the moment. I was frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of what it all meant. The confusion wrapped itself around me like a dense fog, clouding my thoughts, but at the same time, there was a strange clarity, a piercing understanding deep within me. I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. The bond between us had irrevocably shifted, and whether we were ready for it or not, the new path we were about to walk together was already taking shape. I couldn't ignore the undeniable attraction that had begun to quietly, yet powerfully, stir between us, a force that seemed to slowly, imperceptibly, tear down the boundaries I had always known. The very fabric of what had once been safe, familiar, and even predictable now felt fragile, as if the ground beneath us was beginning to shift. The unspoken rules of our relationship, the unspoken comfort of family, seemed to lose their clarity, giving way to something else, something more dangerous, more charged. Each moment spent in his presence seemed to stretch on longer than the last, each second laden with a deeper, unsettling intensity. I could feel the change, not just in the air, but deep within me, as though I was standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into a reality that I wasn't ready to face. In the midst of this growing tension, he hesitated, just for a brief moment, but it was long enough for me to sense the uncertainty in his eyes. There it was, unmistakable, a reflection of doubt, of something he wasn't sure he could name, perhaps not even fully understand. He stopped, his gaze shifting away for the briefest instant, only to return to mine, as though he had been searching for something, trying to make sense of the feelings that neither of us had yet admitted to. But his eyes never wavered from mine for long. They remained fixed, locked on me in a way that both captivated and unsettled me. It was as though he was trying to read me, to understand the emotions swirling behind my gaze, just as I was trying to do the same. I tried to steady myself, to quell the storm of emotions rising within me. My mind screamed at me to stop, to remember that we were family, and these thoughts, these feelings were wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. There were invisible lines in our lives that should never be crossed, sacred boundaries that should never be tampered with. I could almost hear the voice of reason echoing in my head, trying desperately to impose order on the chaos of my emotions. But even as I tried to silence the voice of guilt and rationality, something in his expression held me prisoner. It was a magnetic pull, intense and unyielding. His gaze was not just that of a father, but of a man with his own hidden desires, with his own quiet struggles that he had never shared. And that made me feel both powerful and exposed, vulnerable in a way that I had never known. It was as if, in that moment, we were both stripped bare, our thoughts and feelings laid out before each other in a way that defied logic and reason. There was no need for words between us. We understood the depths of what was happening, what was shifting, without speaking a single sentence. The room, once filled with the casual hum of everyday life, suddenly felt charged with an electricity that seemed to pulse in the very air around us. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling as though it were an eternity. The silence between us was thick, almost oppressive, and yet it felt alive, filled with possibilities. It was as though time itself had slowed, the outside world fading away, leaving only him and me, suspended in that delicate moment. I was painfully aware of the direction we were heading, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop it. We were at a crossroads, each step forward leading us into uncharted territory, but none of us knowing what awaited on the other side. The struggle between desire and reason raged inside me, fierce and unrelenting. I felt as though I was caught between two worlds, one that was grounded in the safety of the known, and the other in the heady allure of something new, something forbidden. Every part of me screamed to step back, to pull away, but another part, one far deeper, whispered to stay, to see where this moment, this connection, would take us. My attempt to break the tension felt almost desperate, as though I was grasping for something solid in a world that was beginning to slip away from my control. I spoke, but my voice betrayed me. It came out shaky, uncertain, a reflection of the turmoil that churned within me. I could hear the wavering quality of my own words, and I knew, without a doubt, that he heard it too. He caught it in the air between us, that crack in my facade, the uncertainty that had slipped into my voice. Without a word, without making it obvious, he pulled back, giving me the space I didn't even know I needed. In that instant, he diffused the moment with a soft, nervous laugh, one that broke the tension, but at the same time, shattered something delicate inside me. Relief washed over me in waves, relief that the pressure had eased, but with it came a deep, sinking feeling of disappointment. It was as though I had wanted more, needed more, and the chance for something profound had slipped through my fingers. In the days that followed, we both tried our best to ignore what had passed between us. We resumed our daily routines, pretending as if nothing had changed, as if the air between us wasn't thick with unspoken words. But I could feel it, in every conversation, in every glance, in every accidental touch. There was a new awareness, an undercurrent running through everything we said and did. It was as if we were walking on a tightrope, each step measured, cautious, knowing that a single misstep could undo everything we had left unspoken. There was a weight to every word, every look, like a fragile thread connecting us, one that could snap at any moment. One afternoon, while we were both in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal together, something shifted again. It wasn't deliberate, but when our hands brushed together in the heat of the moment, it felt as if the world around us stopped. It was just the lightest touch, a brush of skin against skin, but it sent an electric pulse racing through my body. It was as though a switch had been flipped, and suddenly, the room was charged with a raw intensity that neither of us could ignore. We froze, locked in that shared moment, eyes meeting in a way that spoke volumes without a single word passing between us. It was one of those moments that could change everything. I stared at him, desperately searching for any clue in his eyes, any sign that he understood what I was feeling, what was happening between us. But all I saw was confusion, a mixture of emotions that mirrored my own. Neither of us had the answers. Neither of us knew what this was, or what it meant. But in that moment, I knew that we were both struggling to make sense of it, to understand what this new, fragile connection meant for us, for our lives, and for the future. Finally, I broke the silence with a forced laugh and pulled away to avoid making the moment we had just shared any more obvious. I told myself that this was all a misunderstanding, that we were exaggerating things, but deep down, I knew there was something deeper at play. That night, after another long conversation, he mentioned how my mom's absence had made him realize many things in his life. He spoke of loneliness, of his doubts, about how sometimes you don't know what you have until you lose it. Every word he said made me feel more drawn to him, closer than I had ever imagined. While he spoke, I noticed that his words were not only sincere, but also carried an emotional weight I had never perceived in him before. It was as if, for the first time, he was showing me a part of his soul that he kept hidden from the rest of the world. That moment felt eternal, as if we were trapped in a bubble where time didn't exist, and where only the two of us mattered. We were changing in a way I never imagined. The following night, everything changed again. We were in the living room, the dim light casting soft shadows that danced on the walls. The conversation shifted to memories of the past, things we did when I was a child. He always seemed to have a smile for me, and we laughed about pranks and inside jokes. But there was a subtext in everything we said, a kind of unspoken understanding that didn't need words. At one point, he stopped talking and looked at me in a way that left me motionless. It was a gaze I had never seen before, deep and filled with a mix of sadness and desire. I felt my heart race, and I wondered if he was experiencing the same thing I was. This connection that I couldn't ignore should exist, but was impossible to ignore. I felt the air grow heavier, the distance between us shrinking, though neither of us moved. My mind was divided between reason and desire, between what I knew was right and what my heart wanted. I knew at that moment that something in me had changed forever. He leaned slightly toward me, and for a second, I thought he was going to say something. But instead, his hand reached out to mine. I felt his warm skin against mine, a touch that was more intimate than I ever imagined. Neither of us spoke. Our gazes said everything. Unable to bear the tension, he made a clumsy joke to lighten the mood, and he smiled. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. I knew he was trying to act normally, but the silence that followed said it all. Something had changed between us, something that we couldn't undo. If you are still watching this video, and find these lessons useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. The next day, we tried to carry on with our routines as if everything were normal. But every time our gazes met, there was that spark. That connection we couldn't deny. It was a silent fire growing stronger with each passing day, harder to ignore. Finally, one night, while we were in the kitchen preparing dinner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I dropped the knife I was holding and looked at him, asking, "Dad, what's going on between us?" The words came out before I could stop them. He looked at me, surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to be so direct. He remained silent for a moment, his eyes searching mine, as if trying to find the right words to say. Finally, he took a deep breath and murmured, "I don't know, but I feel like I can't control it." That confession took my breath away, and I felt like the ground beneath me was vanishing. My mind was flooded with questions, but none of them had clear answers. What did this all mean? Where was it leading us? I knew we were in dangerous territory that could change our lives forever, but I also knew that no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't turn back. My heart was racing with every second that passed. I didn't know what to say or how to react to that revelation. He was my dad, and although I knew that everything happening was strange and complicated, I couldn't deny that there was something in that tension that pulled me in. It was like a force, something I couldn't fight. We decided not to talk about it further that night, but the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with meaning, as if we both knew that words were unnecessary and that what we were feeling went beyond what we could express. Each glance, each small gesture became a secret code that only we understood. The following days became a continuous dance around what we didn't dare admit. The house filled with a different energy, furtive glances, nervous smiles, each one saying more than any conversation could. We tried to act normal, but we both knew that nothing was the same. One afternoon, while we were in the garden, he spoke to me about his fears, his doubts, and how sometimes people make mistakes searching for something they don't even know they need. I realized that he was just as lost as I was, trying to make sense of what we were feeling, what we were experiencing. His words moved me, and I felt the urge to comfort him, to offer him something I wasn't sure I could give. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his arm, feeling his skin tremble under my touch. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, his lips barely parting as if to say something he couldn't. We stood there, frozen in time, and I could feel the weight of the moment. A part of me wanted to stop time, to stay there forever. But another part of me knew that what was happening was dangerous. We were playing with fire, and the fire was calling to us. That night, after dinner, we sat on the couch. The room was lit only by the soft glow of a lamp. He began speaking, but his words were different this time, full of sincerity that took my breath away. I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't stop thinking about what it could be. His words made me feel a mix of emotions, fear, desire, and something I couldn't define. I remained silent, staring into his eyes, feeling as if every second was stretching longer, as if time had decided to stop just between the two of us. Finally, I couldn't bear the tension anymore. I got up from the couch and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden. I could feel his presence approaching, his shadow blending with mine. "I can't let this go any further," I said, though my voice sounded more uncertain than I wanted. He didn't respond immediately. He just stood beside me, watching me with a mixture of sadness and something I couldn't quite decipher. His fingers gently brushed my arm, and that touch, just that simple touch, was like a spark that ignited something deep inside me, something I couldn't ignore. Without saying another word, he took a few steps back, giving me space to breathe, to think. I knew that he was struggling with his own demons, just like I was. We were both trapped in this whirlwind of emotions that we couldn't control, but it was pulling us in like a magnet. The days continued, each one filled with an unspoken tension, harder to ignore with each passing moment. We tried to pretend that everything was fine, but it was impossible not to notice how every little gesture, every word, was loaded with double meaning. It felt like a game of signs, as if the universe was pushing us to cross a line we never thought we would. One afternoon, while we were in the study, looking through some old photo albums, our hands met again, this time, deliberately. Our fingers intertwined, and I felt a jolt run through my body. I looked up, and he was staring at me, his eyes filled with vulnerability and determination. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he said, his voice rough, filled with sincerity that left me speechless. His confession was like a release, a key that opened the doors to everything we had been suppressing. I felt the ground beneath me crumble, but at the same time, it gave me the strength to take the step I had been afraid to take. I took a deep breath and, without letting go of his hand, I said, "I can't either." That simple phrase, so small yet so complex, changed everything. It was like we had finally surrendered to the inevitable, to what we both knew we could no longer deny. We moved toward each other slowly, as if time had stopped. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, I saw all the desire, the guilt, the longing, and the desperation reflected in his gaze. It was as if we were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into the unknown. He lifted his hand and gently stroked my cheek, and I closed my eyes, savoring the moment. The warmth of his skin against mine filled me with an intensity one had never experienced. He whispered, "I don't want to hurt you," and in his voice, I could hear a mix of fear and hope. "I know," I replied, opening my eyes to look at him again. "But I don't want you to let me go." It was an honest confession, direct, and in that moment, I knew I had stopped fighting what I felt. What had started as a spark had turned into a blaze, and there was no way to put it out. We stayed there, motionless, breathing the same air, feeling the same tension between us. Then, without another word, we leaned in until our foreheads touched. The contact was so intimate, it made me feel more vulnerable and connected than ever before. It was a silent gesture, but it spoke volumes. The outside world ceased to matter, as if everything had been reduced to that small space we shared. We both knew we were playing with fire. With every passing second, we were getting closer to the edge, but we couldn't stop. There was an invisible force pushing us, making us move forward despite everything. Finally, he stepped back, just a few inches. His eyes were fixed on mine, as if searching for a sign, some confirmation that he wasn't alone in this. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a mix of desire and doubt. I took one last deep breath and nodded slowly, not breaking my gaze. "I've never been more sure," I said. And in that moment, I knew we had crossed a line that there was no turning back from. There was no going back, only the path that lay ahead, filled with uncertainty, danger, but also an uncontrollable passion. We stayed there in the silence, so close that the space between us seemed to vanish. His hand, still resting lightly on my cheek, made my heart race. I could feel the heat of his touch like a pulse, steady and urgent. The world around us no longer existed. It was just him and me, trapped in this moment that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The tension was unbearable, yet there was something intoxicating about it, something that made me crave more. The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, he took a small step back, his eyes never leaving mine. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the next move, to confirm that what we were feeling wasn't just some fleeting madness. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Everything I wanted to say felt too small, too inadequate for the enormity of what we were experiencing. "Do you regret it?" His voice was barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. His question hung in the air, suspended between us, and I knew there was no easy answer. How could I regret something so overwhelming, so undeniable? But at the same time, how could I not be terrified of where it might lead? I shook my head slowly, my heart thundering in my chest. "No," I whispered, the truth settling deep inside me. "I don't regret it." His eyes softened, and I saw a flicker of something, relief, perhaps, or maybe fear, or both. He reached out again, this time pulling me toward him gently. Our lips met, and everything else faded away. There was no hesitation this time. It was as if the world had melted, leaving only the heat of our kiss, the closeness we could no longer deny. When we pulled away, our breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps. I looked at him, searching for any sign that he was feeling the same rush of emotions that I was. His face was flushed, his eyes intense with something I couldn't quite name. But I didn't need words to understand. We both knew what had just happened. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. I don't know what's going to happen now, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I can't go back to how things were. Can you? I didn't answer right away. The question was loaded, heavy with implications. Could I go back? Could I pretend that none of this had happened? Could we ever return to the way things were before? I thought about it for a long moment, the weight of the choice pressing on me. No, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't think we can go back. And in that instant, I knew everything had changed. There was no going back, not for either of us. The path before us was uncertain, dangerous even, but it was a path we had already started walking together. There was no turning back from what we had discovered, from the bond that had formed between us. We both stood there, facing the truth we had been avoiding, the truth that was now impossible to deny. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the very walls were closing in around us. But despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, there was a sense of inevitability in the way our eyes met, in the way our hands still lingered together. We had crossed a line that no one could uncross, and though the consequences were still unknown, I couldn't help but feel that we had stepped into something that was as profound as it was dangerous. The connection between us was real, and it would follow us wherever we went. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence full of understanding, of recognition. We both knew that things would never be the same again. Finally, he spoke again, his voice filled with a strange calmness, as if he had come to terms with what had just happened. We don't know what's next, he said. But we have to face it together. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. Maybe we didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came, we would face it together. And with that unspoken understanding between us, we left the room, stepping into whatever the future held, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like a blur, a haze of emotions, fear, and longing. We tried to return to normal, but nothing was the same. Every glance, every word, every small gesture carried more weight than before. It was as if we were living in a world where the rules had changed, where the boundaries that once seemed so clear no longer existed. We both moved through the motions of daily life, eating, cleaning, talking, but there was an underlying tension in the air, a current of unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. We had crossed a line, and neither of us knew how to handle it. One afternoon, as I sat in the kitchen, lost in my thoughts, he walked in. His presence filled the room, and I could feel my heart race as soon as I saw him. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. There was a softness there, something that spoke of understanding and regret, but also of desire, something we both knew couldn't be ignored any longer. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his voice low, "about everything that happened." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to explain, to tell him that it wasn't just some mistake, that it meant something more than just a moment of weakness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, unsure of how to begin. "I know things can't go back to how they were," he continued, stepping closer. "And I don't expect them to. But I don't want to pretend that nothing happened either." The weight of his words sank deep into my chest. It was like he had read my mind. I had been wondering the same thing. Could we really go back to pretending everything was normal? Could we just erase the connection that had formed between us? Could we forget how we had changed each other? His eyes locked onto mine, intense and filled with a complex mixture of longing, regret, and something more. Something deeper, like the unspoken truth of everything we just shared. "I'm scared," he confessed, his voice barely more than a whisper, trembling ever so slightly as if the words themselves were too heavy to bear. "I'm scared of what this could mean for us. For everything we've known." The rawness in his voice echoed through me, stirring emotions I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't deny. "I'm scared too," I admitted, my heart pounding with a ferocity that threatened to break free. "But we can't just ignore it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. We have to face it." There was no turning away now, no pretending we hadn't seen what was right in front of us, no pretending that the ground beneath us hadn't already shifted irrevocably. The silence that followed was profound, laden with the weight of the unspoken. Neither of us dared to speak, and in that quiet, everything hung in the balance. My heart raced, my breath quickened, and I could feel the very air around us humming with energy, a force we couldn't escape, a current that held us in its grip. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. In that moment, it was just the two of us, standing at the edge of something immense, something neither of us had ever imagined, but something that could no longer be ignored. Whatever came next, we couldn't undo what had already happened. We couldn't turn back the clock, nor could we pretend that we weren't forever changed. Finally, his hand reached out, almost hesitantly at first, but when it touched mine, it was warm, strong, grounding. His fingers closed around mine with a gentleness that was filled with so much more than just a touch. There was a promise there, a silent vow, an understanding between us that whatever happened next, we were in this together. No words were needed. The gravity of what we had just shared, what we were both feeling, was enough to hold us in that moment. It was enough to silence the world outside, to keep us anchored in that fragile, beautiful space between fear and possibility. "We'll figure this out," he murmured softly, his gaze steady, searching mine for any sign that I shared his resolve. "Somehow, we'll figure it out." And in that moment, despite all the uncertainty that lay ahead, despite the fear and the confusion, I found myself believing him. We didn't have all the answers, and the future remained an unfathomable mystery. But there was one thing I knew for sure. We couldn't go back to the way things were. The world had changed, irrevocably, and so had we. We were standing at the precipice of something new, something that could either tear us apart or bring us closer than we ever thought possible. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't afraid. Not of the uncertainty, not of the unknown, not of the chaos swirling in my chest. Because, in the end, we had each other. And that, more than anything else, was all I needed to face whatever came next. Together. So, what have you learned from this journey of self-discovery and connection? Have you ever experienced a moment where everything shifted in the blink of an eye? Let us know what resonated with you the most and what you plan to bring into your own life. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave your comment, share your insights, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. We'll see you in the next video.